Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tim Johnson. I'm Senior Indigenous Curatorial Advisor for the Royal Ontario Museum, and I'm delighted you could join us for today's Curator conversation, celebrating the opening of ТUСАРНИTUT Music Born of the Cold, an exhibition organized by the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts and adapted by the Royal Ontario Museum. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the ROM sits on the ancestral lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabeg, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Today's program explores the changing landscape of Inuit music in Canada with multi-award-winning singer-songwriter Susan Aglukark. A lifelong student of her own culture, Susan is president at Aglukark Entertainment, Inc. Her blend of Inuit folk music traditions with country and pop songwriting has made her a major recording star in Canada. And her most successful single is OCM, which reached #1 on the Canadian country and adult contemporary charts in 1995. She's released 7 studio albums and is the first Inuk artist to win 4 Juno Awards, first to win a Juno Award, and she's gone on to win 4 in total, which is remarkable, and the Governor General's Performing Arts Award for Lifetime Artistic Achievement. She's also an officer of the Order of Canada and holds several honorary doctorate degrees and has held many command performances over the years. During a career that has spanned more than 25 years, Susan's journey as a singer-songwriter has led her to reflect on who she is, where she comes from, and the importance of discovery of history, culture, and of self. And during this time of reflection, writing and songwriting, Susan has arrived at one area of profound knowing that the Inuit are an extraordinary people, deeply grounded in a culture forged by their ancestors, and that their journey is what has shaped them. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you, Tim. I'm glad to be here. Matna.
Yeah. So we're going to have a conversation here, and I'm really, it's an honor and pleasure to be with you today, Susan, to discuss your life experience with Inuit culture, tradition, and music, and to learn from you about the foundation and current directions of Inuit music. Let's begin by exploring your connection to Inuit language, and Inuktitut in particular, and how that shaped your knowledge and philosophy, and how, as an interpreter, it influenced and led to the launch of your music career.
Yeah, thank you. So before I could answer that, I think I have to give you some context. When I left home being Inuit Nunangat, I grew up in the Kivalliq region, which is 7 communities on the west coast of the Hudson's Bay. I'm from Arviat. Birth until now, Inuktitut was our first language. English was introduced when we started school, formal education. So maybe grade 2, grade 3. It was not in kindergarten or grade 1. Our household, all Inuktitut. So Inuktitut was our first language. Of course, formal education begins, and then everything switches over to English. But my early years were small town north, Inuit Nunangat, and in our communities, it's still primarily Inuktitut. And then moved to Ottawa, high school, moving to Ottawa, early adult years was all English. So those times, my first about a year and a half in Ottawa, there was no pursuit of singing or songwriting. I was not yet a singer or a songwriter. The work we do now with the charity is engaging dreamers. We don't nurture dreamers in our current environments. We're starting to do that. So the early years of Ottawa was this version of Susan that was not a dreamer. I did not know that I could be anything I wanted to be. A series of happenstances introduced me to art and artists, the company of musicians. And so the early years were really discovery, if you will, and in those early years was a lot of expression as well. And I was most comfortable doing that work. It's songwriting and writing, but it's also conversation in Inuktitut, because that was my primary language even then. So I think language and indigenous language, those of us who can return to it, it's conversational. I don't know much truly traditional Inuktitut, but conversational. It's part of that safe space we talk about when we create our creators of safe spaces for expression. If we can do that work in the language, whatever work we are doing, it's kind of like this grounding of the senses. We sit differently if we can do that work in the language. So the early years was in the language. The following years where I was discovering myself as a songwriter, as a singer, as a performer, a lot of it was and still is in English. But I find I'm more comfortable in the language in Inuktitut. So I have come back to it over the course of there's a song in every album in the language or part of the language, because that's part of my emotional safe space where I'm comfortable emotionally as a creator of songs, writing, and whatever I'm creating. So language definitely has been that space where my senses settle down and I can go into some form of creating. So it wasn't a professional career per se as an interpreter, but it was a big part of the early years of discovery, both as a worker and then as I was discovering my inner artist, if you will.
And you did end up as a language interpreter in Ottawa?
In Ottawa, yes, Indian Affairs, yeah.
Yeah, and tell us how that led to your getting into the music scene.
Yeah, the job title was communications coordinator, which of course the description has changed today with technology. So at that time, communications coordinator meant teaching Inuit history in Ottawa Area High School. So it was translating and interpreting, but also doing this other work in the Ottawa Area High School. So I had started writing in a journal in high school. I now know that some of that writing is poetry. I did not know at the time that it was poetry. And so I wrote this piece in Inuktitut called Kinakpunga, Searching. And it essentially talks about navigating two worlds to finish high school. I was in a residence, a Kecho Hall in Yellowknife to finish high school. So this poem, Searching, becomes part of this presentation in the Ottawa Area High Schools, which becomes this conversation with my then manager and boss, David Webster. And how we got from that conversation of turning this poem into a short documentary about the experience of living between two worlds to finish high school into a music video. I wish I could remember how we ended up with a videographer and somebody in there who writes this piece of music around the video Searching, and we end up in this recording studio in Hull, Quebec. The Indian Affairs building used to have this full recording studio. We end up with this song and this video that gets submitted to Much Music. And this is before I was even songwriting, before CBC Northern Services contacted me, and before the producer who helped me write Arctic Rose, or who I wrote Arctic Rose with. Before any of that was this video on Much Music, before I was a singer-songwriter. So it was kind of this kind of backwards introduction to what I now know is the singer-songwriter and the artist.
What an amazing way to get started that way in your
It was.
career. One of the strengths of the exhibit, ＴUSARNITUT, is its blending of Inuit visual and musical arts. And I really think it deepens and amplifies one's understanding and appreciation of Inuit culture. For you, as someone who has lived within two worlds of traditional and contemporary Inuit culture, I'm wondering what you gained while growing up from traditional artists, musicians, and performers in your home community, from the melodies, songs, and storytelling.
So I had an incredible childhood. I think our generation, all Inuit who grew up in, or Indigenous who grew up in their environments, have an incredible opportunity. I remember growing up in Akviet, and my mother is an incredible artist in her own right. She is a traditional seamstress, but what that means is they also hunted, harvested, and processed their own fur, their own leather. So caribou leather, sealskin, all these things. So we grew up by observation, by hands-on and gently, guiding us, our mother guiding us. I say us because I have 4 sisters and 2 brothers in the traditional ways. And I remember having this conversation with my mother about 5 or 6 years ago about these processes. I was just starting the work for the Arctic Rose Foundation, so arts as expression. And in the language, in Inuktitut, we're having this conversation, and she asked me, "Do you think I'm an artist?" And it was just one of these mic drop moments for me when I realized that our traditional our traditional professional seamstresses don't realize that their work is in fact art. The processes and the steps that they've created to get to their traditional ways of creating, like this tuilik, this beaded tuilik my mother and I made, that is art.
Right.
And so we grew up with that. Local musicians, I was a child in Akviet. Akviet is a very creative and musical community in Nunavut, Inuit community. And I remember we would go to the community hall for community hall events, community events, and we had this wonderful musician, Charlie Panigonak, and watching him, and he was a natural, and he was a performer, he was an entertainer, and he was such a natural singer. I was not a natural singer. I had a lot to learn in my own singing voice. And I had to learn this while headlining. That's a different story. But I remember going back to this community hall and watching Panigoniak singing. We have what we call the Akviet band, and they still play today. And they're natural musicians. They pick up the instrument without a single hour of music lessons. They pick up an instrument and they play professional level musicianship. So, those were the influences. And these are generations of Inuit whose birth and formative years were traditional, whose first language was Inuktitut. And they use the arts and music to create these spaces in our communities. That's the power of arts and music. But those were my influences. And how do you not fall in love with the discovery of your own career in music and arts, given the opportunity, which I have been, and draw from those memories and those experiences in small town North?
That's wonderful. And I know that there exists a profusion of established and emerging Inuit musical artists. To name a few, Tanya Tagaq, Beatrice Deer, Katu, Joey Nauyuk, Pixilk, Shauna Satinik, Junji, Angela Amaralek, Quantum Tangle, Katajak Duo. These are all incredibly talented musicians fusing traditional Inuit music with other genres. As someone with a distinguished career whose work continues to evolve and grow, what can you tell us about the Inuit music scene today, where it's going, and what it contributes to the broader society's comprehension of Inuit life?
I must also mention Twin Flame. So there's wonderful, wonderful Inuit groups coming out of all across Inuit Nunangat.
Yes.
And it's such a great sense of pride infusing, if that's the proper way to say it, to hear what comes out of Inuit Nunangat. And there's this constant movement in our communities. I think what's important for people to observe is that we are talking a couple of generations now of artists coming out of Inuit Nunangat. And as Indigenous artists, we will always be advocates. There is so much in our respective Indigenous groups that we speak out for, that we advocate for. And we're talking 2 and 3 generations now of these advocates. So the younger generations of musicians coming out from Inuit communities are so much more courageous. They have so much more confidence in their presentation, in their exploration, and going into different types of music and movement and dance. And it just gives you this, you can step back and you can watch now, because they've taken on that next level of advocating through their art and through their music
Mhm.
and their form of expression. They are reinvigorating Inuktitut. There are Inuit Nunangat is from Alaska right through to Greenland. So when we talk about language, we have to honor the journey of the ancestors and the language and the difference in dialect. So each artist comes from a different group, part
Wow.
of Inuit Nunangat, and they will use their dialect in their expression, songwriting. Um, I think these parts and pieces are to the listener an opportunity to honor and respect the time and space that we need and we take to unlearn the effects of colonization. And we're, I think, fortunate in that we are given access to this platform, the art and the artists,
Mhm.
to share and to learn from and to glean from and to grow with, but also undo while we are undoing those multi-generational traumas as through the arts. We're also healing, and as we heal, we fall in love with our art, and we want to be artists. We want to find joy in our work. While we are doing the healing work, we're also, some of us are very fortunate to find joy in the process. Painting, you know, give us the time and space to do that. And they're learning to demand that. They are demanding that space. And it's the next stage of healing for Indigenous artists. So I think the art and that platform is that two ways of taking and sharing. Give us the space, honor that space, let us discover language, let us discover art as a healer. And yeah, we need that time. And that would be the takeaway there for me.
Yeah, it's really interesting what you're saying about these young artists really having the bravery and courage to take on advocacy of various issues and to, make their thoughts and ideas known. And I'm deeply interested in Inuit connections to the landscape and the environment from which the culture draws inspiration. It would seem that so much of Inuit music reflects upon these particular lifeways, traversing the land, harvesting, geese hunting, knowledge of seasonal cycles, is but a few examples. And back in 1999, I wrote an extensive article for Cornell University's Native America's Journal entitled World Out of Balance in a Prescient Time, Native Prophecy Meets Scientific Prediction. And this was nearly 24 years ago now, and it was alarming at that time what Northern Inuit and other Indigenous elders were observing. In this regard, I wonder what you can tell us about the current state of the Inuit world.
Hmm. So I was just home in Akvet a couple of weekends ago. I went to go spend Mother's Day weekend with my mother, and she is a very traditional Inuk woman. Her birth and formative years was very traditional. So there is a very strong call for Inuit still to go out in season. So it was fishing season. So we went out and took my mother fishing for Mother's Day. So what happened then was a couple of days before I was to fly home, I was talking with my mother, and she was very concerned because I love fishing. I love ice fishing. That's my favorite form of fishing. And she goes, so we have to be very, very careful because spring is a month early, which means that everything is melting really, really fast right now. A couple of weeks ago. So the lakes were still frozen. There was still snow on the lower parts of the ground, but the higher parts were already brown, which means where there still should have been snow and things should still have been white and the lakes would still have been ice and snow, the ground had melted. So there was spring season, what looked like spring and early summer a month early. And
Mm.
this has been changing over the years. It has gotten warmer and warmer over the years. So the seasons have been shifting earlier, which has made it more dangerous for hunters and fishers and traditional
Right.
harvesting season. So it shifted all of that. But you're right, it has been going on a lot longer. I remember one of my trips north with my mother, and we were talking about berry picking, for example. So she knows all these places to go. And And then she just kind of looks over out on the tundra and she goes, "There's a species of flower I have never seen before." So in her lifetime, we know the tundra, we know the flowers, we know everything you grow up with. And then there was this flower that was new to her, which says a lot for her to say, "I've never seen that before." That's happening. There are earlier dry spells, so water is becoming an issue up there. Um, there was this one memory that struck me really, really hard about 10 or 12 years ago. And I was a very young child. I was maybe 11 or 12 years old. And we would run from the school to what was the Hudson Bay, now the Northwest Company. And we go there and hope maybe somebody will buy us a chocolate bar. We're very, very good. And we're all outside the Northwest Company waiting. And this elder woman who lived on the street that I lived on. So there's 5 or 6 rows of houses. And she lived in one and we lived at the end. And she was heading home with her grocery bags, and they had just introduced plastic bags. So I grabbed a couple of her bags, and we were walking home. And I remember her very matter-of-factly saying in Inuktitut, and I paraphrase, "Nunavut unakiak kanok piniak pa ukuningan." I wonder what our land will do with this what we now know as plastic. I don't know if we had a word for it yet, but I wonder what our land will do with this, which is the plastic bags we were carrying. And we're talking about 40 years ago, that our elders then understood that there was this new technology coming in that the earth would not know what to do with. So there's that traditional sensibility and knowledge that our elders had even then,
Right.
40, 50 years ago. So there's a lot of that conversation that has been going on for a very long time among the Inuit and Indigenous communities.
Yes, and I know that they have provided tremendous leadership on this particular issue as well for for a couple of decades now at least. And I think it's very important that you along with the rest of the world stay on this subject matter, because it is one of those existential issues, right, that we really have to be mindful of. And I'm mindful that we move through this conversation without providing a translation for TUSARNITUT. So maybe you can tell us what that means.
Yeah. So the word you're using is, I think that dialect is from the northern Quebec region, if I'm correct. It's very similar to our dialects for tusangniktut. So we have the ka sound, tusangniktut. Means the same thing. They sound tusangnikuni. It sounds so good. They sound good. They are a beautiful sound, is what that translates to.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation. Before we get to whatever questions and answers we have from our listeners, I do want to invite you to Six Nations of the Grand River. I'd love to spend more than just 20 or 30 minutes speaking with you and
yes.
Host you for dinner.
Okay, thank you.
So yes, any of the listeners can provide questions in the Q&A section of the site here. So we have a question here from Carolina. From both a professional and personal perspective, why do you think people need to see the exhibit, TUSARNITUT, Music Born of the Cold?
I think we are living in times where we have an opportunity to correct the narrative. And what that means is, I say that both sides, the Indigenous and non-Indigenous community, has been told one story for so long that we have come to believe it. And opportunities that museums give us, where they share some incredible art from many, many generations, and giving us access to these spaces, giving us opportunity to be the ones to share the stories, because we see it through a very different lens than a non-Indigenous person would, gives the viewer an opportunity to see it and hear it from our perspective. And it will be a different perspective. And this is part of correcting narratives. The more we unlearn ways, the more we sit in these spaces equally and safely without judgment together. Access to these spaces lets us do that, lets us share and sit in these spaces together without without that judgment. And that's part of undoing that narrative so that we can get to that equal space before we can really begin that reconciliation conversation, for example. We need to get to that equal space first. And I think access to arts in these spaces is one of the ways that we do that.
Absolutely. And for those who have the opportunity to visit the exhibit in person, I would highly recommend it. The visual arts, the carvings and the masks and the paintings, all of that is just absolutely extraordinary. And when you do combine it with the musical arts as well, it seems to me you get a much richer understanding of Inuit culture more broadly. Rita asks, would like to know more about the garments behind you and also what you're wearing.
Sure, thank you. So I have this beautiful atigi, I call it atigi. Kalikuk is what it is in the Western Arctic, where it comes from. So there is a sisters from Cambridge Bay, Nukaret, and that's the name of their company, is Nukaret, which means sisters. And it's the Delta braid. So this is very specific to their community, the Western Arctic Inuit community. So what you see on here is very intricate details. And this, of course, is orange to represent our Orange Shirt Society's campaign around our children being discovered. So this is the piece I had made by our Inuit artist, Nukaret is what it's called. And this is from the same region. So the Western Arctic has this incredible way of creating the sunburst, and they have beautiful designs. So I had this commissioned several years ago, and Inuit elder women from Cambridge Bay made this piece for me. And this is Western Arctic design. So you can trace who Inuit are by the clothing they wear. So we go on to the Eastern Arctic, and we in the Eastern Arctic wear two styles of amautit. So in the West, they will wear this, and they can carry babies in the back of this. But this is one of two designs, amautit. This one's called the tuilik, and it can be you can carry a baby in this. It's it's often worn now for ceremony and special events, but its original design without the beadwork was also to carry the baby. But there's also this very unique thing where the sleeves there's a pouch in the sleeves. And so what happened with that was a mother could move a baby from the back in through the pouch and into the front to nurse the baby, and then put the baby back again without the baby ever having to leave the outfit. So this was originally made in caribou fur. So that was this design. There's a second design. So this is Western Arctic. This is Western Arctic, Nunavut, Nukaret with the Delta braid. And this is Eastern Arctic beadwork that my mother and I did.
Very nice. Thank you for the explanation. We have a couple more very interesting questions coming in. Okay. Going back to the conversation of climate change, how has climate change changed your music, if any?
Well, actually, that's a wonderful question because, in fact, I approached Bruce Coburn over a year ago because I have a list of folks I've been wanting to collaborate with for some time now. And we watched on the news incidences in the Nunavut region, fire coming out of kitchen taps, for example, in Iqaluit. And this is alarming. This is just so alarming that Inuit Nunangat, the Arctic, is being affected now. And so I was quite concerned, very concerned, and reached out to Bruce to ask him if he would be interested in writing a song with me. And he just released his version of it. So his new album has a song that he and I wrote called To Keep the World We Know. Very important collaborations where I continue to reach out to other, there's one other Indigenous artist that I'm going to write the next song with around advocating. These are important to keep in the forefront of our leaders. We can't forget and let them keep reminding them that these are incredible times we're living in. We have one chance to get this right. Don't forget that. And consult. So yeah, those are very important times. And the more these things happen, the more courage we find to speak up. and
Right.
partner and work together and collaborate.
Right. Another listener, Jamie, wonders how much you were able to influence and control your own image. Did you encounter industry people trying to dictate what you should look like or act like throughout your career?
No, I have been very, very fortunate that in the years that I was with a major label, I was with EMI for about 10 years.
Mhm.
That they didn't influence or control any part of my appearance at all. I had a very good relationship with them in the years that I was with them. And I think that allowed for me to find myself, because it's not that I was a confused person per se when I first started the career. I just didn't know. I
Mhm.
really didn't know. There's a lot I didn't know about the career. And the more I learned about it, the more I reconnected with my ways of
Yeah.
representation and being,
Yeah.
and representation absolutely matters, especially now. And I discovered that, and they stayed out of the way for me to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems like you of course knew your own identity, knew what you wanted to say, and you just moved in that direction, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Jamie also was very complimentary here about your song OCM, and felt it was, when it was on the air, was so much different from anything else when it first came out.
Mm.
She says it's such a beautiful song, as all of the tracks are from that album. And since that time, have you noticed any changes in the public's and or media's perception and treatment of you as an Indigenous performer since you began?
Um,
I mean, you know, the attention on Indigenous peoples has grown considerably in the last 10, 15 years.
yeah, absolutely. You know, when I first started, um, there was Willie Dunn, there was Buffy St. Marie,
Yeah.
there was Cashton. Cashton was coming up at the same time that I was. They had done a bit more work than I had. Um, and it was very small at that time, and we had a lot of work to do. And I didn't fully appreciate. Um, and maybe that was the saving grace for me. I went in there so naive.
Yeah.
And they gave me so much room to explore that. And I learned a lot by observing Buffy, and I spent some time with Willie Dunn and Cashton. I was just so in love with Cashton and their use of only their language and French in their work. But again, my experience in the industry, there were times when they needed to influence. Let's say they needed. There was a bit of tension there in the
Mhm.
early years about who to work with, which producers to work with, and that's when I learned to fight. I'm just learning myself. I'm just learning myself in the industry. I have to write what I know, and I know my community. I know what's going on in there. That's what I write about. So it was a little bit of learning on both sides, but for the most part, I think I was very fortunate that I was able to kind of lean on the work that Buffy had done up to that point. So in the mid 1990s, and she's done incredible work at that point and since, and again, Willie Dunn and the other artists. And then over the years, discovering art and the power of the platform, while also staying in love with it and hoping that the body of work, I've actually released 10 albums, that body of work reflects that, so that when young people who, and we're seeing it now, are working towards their own career, they have something more to draw from there. You know, that's what we do now.
Yeah.
So yeah, I hope that answers your question, Jamie.
Well, thank you so much, Susan, for being with us today and sharing with us your own personal journey through music, your observations of the current crop of artists coming up, but also for your wisdom and your knowledge and everything that you've contributed to become an inspiration to so many people.
Thank you.
Really, really appreciate your being with us today.
Thank you.
And thank you to all the visitors for joining us and joining myself and Susan Aglukark for this wonderful conversation today. I hope you have a chance to visit TUSARNITUT music Born of the Cold. It's on display at the ROM until September 24th. Thanks again for joining us.